Hello, everybody. I'm the FHIR Product Director, and also I am the maintainer of the IG Publisher. And so this session is about advanced features that we've added to the IG Publisher in the last couple of months, actually this year. There's two things that I want to talk to you about. One is multi-language IGs, and the other is testing features that we've added. These are by no means the only features, but these are the ones I'm telling you about today. And so both of these are documented, and the document links are in the presentation, which you'll get. So to start with, multi-language IGs. So most IGs that we publish are in English. I mean, all the ones that we, HL7, publish are in English, but most of the affiliate IGs are also in English. And for most of the affiliates, that's a preference, but for some affiliates, it's not. It's just a reality. And even if you are doing your best as an affiliate to produce an implementation guide in another language, you still get lots of English in the implementation guide. But there's a few affiliates and partners that have legal obligations to produce implementation guides that are genuinely multilingual. And in particular, the WHO has a regulatory mandate to produce content in 6 languages. And WHO chose to support us to be able to produce an implementation guide in multiple languages. And that is in the financial sense. And we did a first round of development earlier in the year where I laid down the foundations in the implementation guide publisher, but it wasn't usable to anybody. And then they gave us another round of funding, and a few of us actually kicked into high gear while we were in Madrid 3 weeks ago, said, let's go for it. So is Jose in the room? Yeah, Jose. And Lloyd, who's over here where you can't see him, he's hiding in the corner like usual. And myself really just went for it. Did you sleep, Lloyd? Some sleep, okay. And Jose as well, who did most of the actual language work. And so now we have a fully assembled IG. So there's a link down there in the slide for the multi-lang test IG. You can download the Git, run it in the IG publisher, and you will get a fully multilingual IG. I was going to give you a demo, but then I randomly chose the wrong PC, so that's pretty stupid of me. But the way it works is that we generate in the same implementation guide, but we generate the content in a subdirectory. So it'll be /en or /fr or /ru or whatever. And all IGs now are moving to that model where even if they're monolingual, all the content will move to a subdirectory for the language that they're in. In the root directory, there's an HTML file which matches the existing HTML files that are produced, but it's the only content in there is a script that looks at the language preference of the user and redirects to the most appropriate subdirectory. Of course, if there's only one subdirectory, then that's where you'll go. But if there's multiple directories, it'll do a best effort at figuring out which one you want and go to that one, unless you've changed language. It will remember if you switch languages, it'll remember your choice. And so if you say back on, I just want to see the English version, then you'll see the English version no matter what your browser says. And at any page in the entire IG, there's a language switcher at the top right of the page, and you switch language and everything changes for the language, including, which is a bit disorientating when it happens, turning the page over for right to left languages. And then the drop-down suddenly appears on the top left rather than the top right. The existing resources that appear when you actually go to the IG and look at the resources, the resource source, they will now appear full of translations. with all the translations in place using the translation extension. And in the packages, in the core package, you'll get all the resources with all of the translations in them. So they're actually quite big because they're loaded up with translations. And then we also produce sub-packages. So you could say, let's say, to pick randomly, smart, who.smart.immunisations, that's going to contain all 6 languages in all of the resources all the way through. Whereas who.smart.immunisations.pt will be Jose's Portuguese version, and all the resources will be in Portuguese. So you can select, I mean, they don't do Portuguese, the WHO, but never mind. So you can pick the language of interest you can either inherit all the languages or the language that you wish. From an editorial perspective, producing a multi-language implementation guide is not for the faint of heart. You have a lot of content to translate, and the content that you have to translate comes from 6 different places, and I'm going to work through each of these places. Text from the underlying terminologies, text from the core, text from the Java code, text from the template, the text in your resources, and the text from the narrative pages you author as part of the specification. All of those contribute text into the output narrative in the actual implementation guide. Some of those are really hard to translate. So external content text comes from a terminology server. There's a well-described specification, which I'm talking about with Ruben later in the week, around how the language API works for terminology servers. And we have an ecosystem of terminology servers now that conform to that and can serve up language content in the language you want, but someone has to actually translate that terminology. Big terminologies like LOINC and SNOMED come with translations. Maybe they have translation to your language, maybe they do not, or to a language of your choice. Otherwise, you have to provision that somehow from the terminology service authority or with a code system supplement. But even if you do it with a code system supplement, sometimes you're not allowed to by the translation, by the code system authority. Then core package dependencies on the FHIR core and the terminology, particularly terminology.hl7.org. You can translate all of these with a language pack. So there's a few language packs in existence now, which are like derivative IGs of a special kind that simply contain translations for a given language. They are implementation guides and published as implementation guides, but all they contain is translation content. Technically, we handle them as code system supplements, and there's pretty much one pack per language. And the affiliates are working on a few, but this has not had a lot of work, and so now is really the time to invest in this. But it's particularly worth it because a lot of system designs lead to the content from the specification going straight into operational systems, particularly code systems and value sets. And you can now translate those for wide use. So it's not only for implementation guides that you publish this. Then, in terms of translation formats, we actually support 3 formats for the content. There's 3 that we define. One is PO, which is a standard Unix language translation format. Then there's XLIF, which is an OASIS standard for translation tools. I don't know what OASIS thought they were doing. The PO format is a bit of a mess, but it's widely supported. But because the PO format really is a mess, and it's kind of like a roller coaster for me trying to support it with all the different tools that do PO stuff. We also defined a JSON format, which is our custom JSON format, which is really like much simpler than all of the other formats and doesn't involve any of the complexities, and that's really our programming target. But even like Jose ended up programming for the POs anyway. And so really our advice is don't use the XLIF, use the PO format, and in some places we only support the PO format, and that integrates with most of the translation tools or websites. And then it's text from the Java code. And so the Java code does a lot of the base rendering, the really clever presentation of the resource content. And there's had a lot of investment in that. It uses a standard Java internationalization framework, but I actually wrote a utility to move the content into PO files. And so there's a set of PO files in the directory nominated there that are the master translations for implementation guides. You can translate both the validator messages, which is good for end users, and you can translate all of the rendering boilerplate text. There's over 3,000 phrases to translate, so it's not for the faint of heart to do that and to maintain that. There's always new phrases every week as we keep developing the content. We've also moved them into Crowdin, which is a website, translation website. So you can either make contributions directly, or you can do it through Crowdin. There can only be one set of translations for a language, although we can do them per region. So affiliates will have to collaborate on this. And there's a way to track the amount of translation work that still needs to be done for each given language. Again, we've had quite some contributions here. We had probably 90% coverage in 4 or 5 languages, but some of those contributions have been AI generated. They all need review. We did a whole bunch for Dutch, which I'm waiting for Alexander to review. But this is, again, work that affiliates really need to do. Then text comes from the template boilerplate, some of the headings and the menu and the guidelines, and so they are translated in the template using PO files in the template, and again, only once for each language, and so contributions needed there. All right, and then the IG resources, which you author those resources in a single language. You do not author them in multiple languages. When the IG publisher runs and it produces output in a translations directory, which is all of the translatable strings and all of the resources that are processed. So it produces a big dump of PO files and the other formats as well. And then what you do, and it cycles existing translations. So then as a translator, you take that file, load it into whatever you want, a text editor or a PO editor or a website, then save the output after you've contributed some more translations back into input translations and run the IG publisher again. And the translations just go around in that circle. Orphans get maintained, so if something changes and something like the source changes by one character, we don't actually throw away the translations. You just have to fix them up, and so it just goes around in circles. And it's a simple process. It's just breakingly big. And then finally, the narrative pages, which are Markdown or XHTML, you just reproduce in /translation/lang/page content and then translate them. And if there's no translation for a page, we fall back to the untranslated page from the master language with a note saying this hasn't been translated because the content's not available. Okay, so the process is conceptually straightforward. For every piece of text, there's got translations got to come from somewhere. It's complicated because you've got to figure out where they came from. You've got to deal with the size of the work required. And there's a lot of text, and a lot of it changes constantly. AI is not quite usable yet. You can generate translations, and they're close, but you do need to review them. Some of in the Java code, particularly, we have a lot of grammar and plural work. Then you have to figure out how to get the phrasing correct. And also a lot of the output from the IG publisher has grammar built into it, HTML tags built into the grammar to highlight stuff, and so that's an extra challenge. But we're in beta phase now, ironing out the kinks, and what we're looking for is a translations officer, a volunteer who will, administer and encourage people to do translations and keep nagging them and make sure that we have good review of contributed translations. So if you think that might be you, come and talk to me after this. All right. at the end, we'll have questions at the end. Now, support for testing. So towards the end of last year, we were getting lots of feedback that the ecosystem needed better testing support. And so I sat down, and particularly with Carl from WHO, and made up a list of things I wanted to do for testing support, and here they are. So first of all, we want people to be able to test the IG itself, test profiles. We want to help you create testing data. We want to make it easier to integrate test data into the IGs. We had to deal with the problem of test data life cycles and better ways to describe test cases. So let's work through those. So profiles, most IGs contain profiles. And IGs can and should, and have to for some publishers, contain examples of those profiles. But if those examples are not valid, then we jump up and down and go, well, you've got an invalid example, fix it. And so it's hard, well, you can't include examples whose purpose is to prove that the profile actually rules them out and says they're not valid. So you can't properly test the profiles. So what we want is a set of test inputs that the profile should fail, that separate from the content of the IG, so we know they're not real proper resources, and we should say, if we want, not just that they should fail, but how they should fail. And so here's a test case example of a JSON file that you can refer the publisher to, and it loads this and says, I'm going to actually run all these test cases. So each has a URL, which is the test, the profile that's being tested, along with a list of tests, each of which is a source file, the description of what you're testing, and the outcomes of the testing. And the IG publisher will actually check all those validations as it goes, and it will put in the QA file if any of them failed. That is, if the failure that you expected to happen wasn't the failure that you got, right? And one of the interesting things about that is quite often the output varies a little bit between the output of a test case. It varies a little bit. Maybe the date's crept in there, and you want to say, well, the date constantly changes or the stated version constantly changes, and I don't want to have to keep correcting the test cases. And so this comes up a lot in testing that we're doing. And so what I defined is the concept of something I called a matcher type, which is a totally made-up word. It's a template for a resource, or technically specification by example. So it's used as a matching criteria. Does a resource that's an output from a test process match what we would expect? And I'm trying to avoid using the word template because it's so heavily overloaded. And it's not a profile. It's a data instance with exceptions in the rules. And so you can add into the example resource matching rules around completeness, optional elements, sorting, so it doesn't matter what order it appears in, you can still check it, and count criteria, and then you use $rule instead of value, so the value can change. And I'll show you an example, but there's a bunch of examples in the validated test cases. So these are the kind of things you can say when you're actually getting a field value. So instead of saying the date is a particular date, you say, I want a date here, but I don't care what the date is as long as it's a valid date. And so that's what you do here, a valid date. Or you can specify other kinds of outputs, the current version of FHIR, or it has to be a SEMVer version, or potentially it has to be one of these fragments. And so we use this in the terminology tests for Michael Onto server produces slightly different messages. Well, they don't have to be the same message, but we really want them to actually mention the value set that's the problem. And so the rule is that the content must, whatever the error message is, it must mention this fragment. And then I know that that's an acceptable error message, even if the error message itself is hypervariable. Right, that worked really well. So here's an example. We first of all got a marker to say that this is a matcher type, and then all the tools know that this is not a real resource and validate it accordingly and don't treat it like a real resource. And this one simply says, this ID, it doesn't have to be this, right? In fact, it doesn't even, no, it doesn't have to be present. If it's present, it has to be this value, but it doesn't have to be present. That's what this says. It's optional. Or alternatively, a little bit more a complex example, this is a matcher type where you sort the patient name by the criteria of the text of the name. And so it doesn't matter what order the server actually gives them to you in, this is the order that they will be resorted and compared to this sorted list. And so the matcher types are driven for, matcher types are driven to work with diff programs. Like I will run the terminology server tests there's 353 today, and then I just do a diff program to diff them all. And when they're differing in the diff, I can actually mostly just move them over with a diff program. And so it's really about scaling that kind of behavior. And I recommend that to anybody who's doing testing with resources. The next thing we can do is create test data. So this is to register test factories for the IG, and then the test factories can produce lots of resources from spreadsheets or from database files or CSV files and some other weird cases. And then the examples, you either generate the examples with the liquid script, so you have total control over the examples. So you just feed it 50,000 rows in a spreadsheet, and bingo, you have 50,000 resources. Or you can actually generate them by profile. So you can just say, hey, fill out an example of this profile. And then when you do that, they can either be part of the IG itself and rendered and shown to the user as part of the content of the IG, or they could just be tucked into the IG in the collateral. So when you open up the package, you find all the testing resources, but we don't nag the user with 50,000 lists in the HTML. So with liquid templates, you run the liquid template once for each row of the input, and it saves it as a file, and the resource ID will be populated. It's actually JSON5 because commas and liquid, you really don't want to be arguing with that. And here's a typical thing to insert a row of data. A piece of data is row.name, so the name of the cell in the source, and you can do lookups. And I'm not going to spend more time on that. Alternatively, you can generate by profile. So you can say, here's a spreadsheet, here's a profile, generate by the profile, and then you'll get a row, resource for each row. By default, we'll just fill the profile based on the definitions in the profile with fixed values and then random values. And then you fill out the values that you can from the source spreadsheet. So the idea is that the data source you provided is actually a business artifact, the kind of spreadsheet that a clinician would give you and say, here's my cases. And it's like a real transform away from the data because they're not a data person. They're thinking in human terms, and so we expect to work the data over. And if we don't have data in the input source, then what I actually do when I use random data is I've got a database full of random data from every published IG. And I just randomly pick random data out of that for the path. So it's not entirely randomly generated data. And then if I can't do that, I'll generate truly random data. So massaging the data, it's expected that you're going to have to work the data over. And I thank Bryn down the back there for contributing a lot of this, this knowledge. And so you're going to expect to say, I need to map from a named column to a path in a resource. I might need to build a composite data type from multiple fields. I might need to do a data lookup into a terminology or another data source. I might have to extract the value from the text or look up a value. So here's an example. There's the kind of spreadsheet is actually taken out of my test cases where you would get this from a doctor who says, well, this is a patient ID, their name, their date of birth, their contacts. I'm going to have to process out their contacts into the profile. And then, whether they were a complete or discharged, whether they have been discharged, the blood pressure, weight in kilograms, warfarin. This is a lookup into another table. And so you can work this data over in a typical format that you get from a clinician who's working in the project and generate input resources, output resources from those. Having generated those, you can then ask them, instead of going in the IG itself in examples, you can actually put them in /tests. And so the package contains all this testing data. All this you can say for generated data from the test factories, that they go straight in there. And you can also add other folders. So for instance, the terminology testing system, I maintain all the tests by hand, but they all go in the package, and I just actually dig them out of the package when it's time to do the testing. And not only that I can put them in the tests folder, I can also actually write a liquid script that processes the JSON straight into the narrative. So although they're in the test cases test folder, I can describe them with a liquid script generated from the test cases. And all of these things you can see in either the guidance implementation guide, which the reference was at the front, or the terminology ecosystem IG. Now, one of the things that happens with test data is I can publish test data with the IG, and we've got a few IGs where that is exactly how it works. SQL on FHIR, the terminology testing ecosystem. But most IGs, it's actually a really complicated process to do the testing, and you publish the IG and then you iterate in the community, building better and better test capability. And that's a cycle that happens, and you go back and publish and you keep the tests up to date. And so the tests are actually they're subject to later changes. So what we can do now is talk about related IGs and say, because you can't do circular IG references where the IG refers to its test and the test refer to the IG. What you can do is call related IGs a forward reference to a closely related IG. And then you can refer to the content. Links are reconciled at publication time. So I don't know where the resource is going to be when I'm doing it. No, I know where it's going to be when I'm doing a CI build, but that's going to be a different place if it's going to be published. And the publisher keeps track of all this and automatically fills this out, and also looks for usage references in related IGs. And so it's now possible to have an IG along with a testing IG that's related to it that cycles over really quickly, but they actually point to each other. So there's still some challenges around that, but that allows you to actually link and refer into your test cases while letting the test cases keep changing. Finally, we have test script as a resource, but it's not very adaptable because it's focused on very low-level testing of the RESTful APIs. We have lots of test cases now, thousands and thousands of them, in a whole bunch of different test cases, where what we have is a pretty common approach. We have a test with a set of suites. Each has a set of test cases. Each have had input, expected output, maybe parameters to affect the way it behaves, but we have a common runner to run them. And so what we've done is we've defined a common format for all of them. This is actually going to go into R6 and into the IG publisher, but is not quite there yet. And the content is a standard metadata resource, a reference to a runner, which is a narrative description of how you run these tests, followed by the input parameters that the testing engine can take, dependency and requirements tracing, and then for each test case, inputs, parameters, expected outputs, and potentially assertions. In the rest of this year, I am going to move all of our testing content everywhere over to this format. They're all at the moment in various JSON and XML custom formats, but they're all going to move to this format. So and then we'll add native support to that format, to the IG publisher and the validator and so forth. And then that will be part of R6, but we will adopt it this year. Okay, so you can find me on chat.fhir.org. These subjects we usually discuss on IG creation, or you can email me. Feedback. Now, question time. Anybody got any questions? Yes, we'll start here.
Is it on?
Yeah.
You talked about multilingual IGs.
Yep.
Does that mean that the QA page is in English?
The QA page will remain in English.
Because
we're not investing effort in translating the QA page. But if, on the other hand, your master language is not English, because you're doing a monolingual, I forgot to mention that, multilingual IGs must have English as a master. at least at the moment. But if you're doing a single language, you can nominate a different language. And if you do, then your QA page will be partially translated. Well, that's your luck. We are not investing in getting the QA page fully translated.
So right now, it's not possible to have, say, a Dutch as the realm and an English QA page.
No, if your realm, if your language output is specified as Dutch, your QA page will be partially translated into Dutch. Yeah, but not wholly, because there's a whole bunch of text there. Like every string that needs translation takes me between 3 and 5 minutes. And there's thousands of them, so that's a substantial a substantial amount of time.
Thank you for the presentation. Great work, everyone involved. So one question with the lang in the brackets. Are you using their specific value set or an ISO standard, like saying, okay, these are EN and then dash in the or the country? Is there anything specific on there?
They have to be 3166 language codes.
3166. It's
Yeah,
the country.
which is XML lang.
Okay.
They have to be either language or language-region. We don't support anything more than language-region, but we do support language-region. Yeah.
My question, is there any restriction to have multi-language IGs in R4, or is it only targeted to be fully working on R6?
So at the moment, the IG publisher supports versions 3 to 5 and R6 on life support. I'm going to address that before September. All of these features that I described apply to all the versions that we support, and that won't change.
For multi-language IDs, will it be possible to copy a language-neutral link? So if I have, the Spanish IG page open, but I want to give it language-neutral, so somebody gets it open in German for them, by the automated chooser, will there be a way to do that?
Lloyd?
Just grab the link and remove the subdirectory.
I think Vadim wants something slightly slicker than that. You can take that up with Lloyd later, because right now the answer
Figure out what you want the UI to look like, and we can talk. Do you want me to? I've got it up.
Does anyone want a demo, since I used the wrong? Yeah, okay. All right, Lloyd.
You want this to talk?
He can talk, and I'll be Vanna.
HDMI. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So you can see up the top here, English. This is all English. We'll go to Dutch. So you can see that most of it has changed to Dutch. There's a few bits that we haven't got to yet. So the yellow bit in yellow, I haven't got around to doing translations for, but most of the rest is translated. Go to Portuguese, why not? So again, it's been translated. Up the top here, where flags. I was in Finland on Sunday the week ago, and I was trying to use the ticket machine and it had this word. I'm like, it's all in Finnish. I don't know, where's the English? And it was Suomi. And I had to touch Suomi to get English. Super, super confusing. So we've got flags here. And now if you drop it down again, Lloyd, you'll see the flag for Arabic is the Arab League flag. But this is super politically controversial. So we'll have to see how that plays out. But choose that. And you can see that now everything's been flipped over. We got not a lot of translations for Arab. That's still work in progress. We've got an Arab contributor, but he's busy traveling right now. So you can see that we're getting there with the translations. Now if you want to go, actually, go to the XML or the JSON, one of the two. And you'll see here, We've got some translations. This is, you can see, this is, like I said, there would be issues, right? Work in progress, Arab content, but only partially translated. It all could be translated, but we haven't filled all that out. Let me think. Yes, back to English then. All right. And if you were close enough and you could see that the URL /en is /ar, whatever is changing. Yes, and if you drop that out and just go straight to the root, just go straight to the root, and you'll see you didn't notice you got redirected without noticing to the language appropriate version. All right, any other questions?
Do all the different releases of your IG have to have the same set of languages?
No. No, and then don't go and ask the logical corollary because I don't know the answer. I don't know about the cross-version stuff yet. The cross-version, like the history page and whatever, we haven't, that's over the horizon for now. For now, it's enough to have multiple languages in the IGs themselves. Vadim again. Vadim did the Russian translations, by the way. Thanks, Vadim.
Yes, it'll really help a lot of Central Asian countries adopt FHIR. Moving on to test data,
Yep.
where do you see matchy types being useful the most?
If you set out to write output criteria for your testing, and as soon as you start doing that in bulk, you're going to run into the fields that aren't the same every time you run. Dates, IDs. You're going to run into fields where, for various reasons, you don't really care if they change as long as they're essentially the same. They're going to change between different systems for different languages or whatever. And as soon as you start trying to write those tests in bulk, then you're going to have to figure out what to do about that. So you could write a profile that specifies the content that's acceptable, but what a lot of hard work, 100 times as much work than just describing an instance and then going, that value there is $date $, because I don't care what it is as long as it's a date. That's when they become useful. And then you can do you can make a change that changes you can agree as a group that you're going to make a change that's going to change the output for 70 of them, of 70 of your 300 tests. So you just run all the tests again and then diff the inputs and the outputs and then boom, 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 done. That's where matcher types really, really become really effective. They're not really, there's a point at which you get so much variation that they collapse and they can no longer useful. You're trying to go, how on earth do I get this? That's the time to stop. But for a lot of testing stuff, that's a really common situation where almost all the resources are going to be the same and has to be the same, but these 2 or 3 fields can vary a bit. So I do them in the terminology test system where we have, I'm going to do several hundred expansions. And for all the expansions, I'm going to tell you exactly what the expansion content has to be in order to be a compliant server, but every expansion has a date, time, and an ID in it, right? So we just say, we don't care what they are, they've just got to be there. That's when match types are really strong and useful. Diego.
Was another question.
Okay, Roland.
Hello. Is there an interaction between multi-language IG and the test cases? Is this supported? Is this...
And my experience so far in that is the test cases are all language specific in order to get language specific outcomes because I cared about that. I haven't thought about multi-language test cases, and maybe I won't. I'll think about it.
In my experience testing, especially with IPS, is that usually you need some positive cases where you have the information and some negative cases where you don't have the information. So in that case, it's not enough with an Excel because sometimes you don't have anything in Excel. So there are like two different templates or two different, not templates, two different, whatever you say them they are.
Well,
How do you,
typically-
what would be the strategy to test that?
Well, typically, if you're writing you're typically writing special cases to test the profiles. I didn't expect you to think about generating the failing test cases. Usually they're handcrafted by copying an actual working document and just hacking out the bits that you want to fail. And so the test factory is not about testing the profiles. I'm expecting authors will do that by handcrafted resources. It's about producing testing collateral for downstream testing, for implementations to say, well, I've got thousands of resources to play with.
Oh,
Thanks.
hello. Grahame, testing data, can it handle empty values, repeating values, that kind of thing for an element?
So typically, and it can handle empty values, yes, and there was some in the test case that I showed there. Repeating values is a little bit trickier because actually it's essentially a table. So you've got a single value, but you can cut the value up into multiple values to some degree. And I'm expecting that we'll have, a bit of a contest to figure out where the sweet spot is between complexity and capability there. Nobody else? No other questions? Yep, one here.
The translation language packs, where are those going to be hosted?
So it's a partly a governance question. At the moment, anybody can create a language pack and you can put it wherever you want. But if when the affiliates are defining language packs, mostly I create the language pack and put them on GitHub in the HL7 GitHub. Some of the affiliates have their own GitHubs and I put them there. But we want the affiliate language packs to be hosted on GitHub, either in HL7 or in affiliate GitHub. But anybody can create their own language pack and you put it wherever you want. But I do generally recommend that you put it on GitHub somewhere and use the CI build to make it available to the entire tooling ecosystem.
Thank you. You said that providing language packs is going to be a task for the affiliates. Do you have any recommendations about tooling that they might want to use to basically crowdsource that, or is that still a not well understood area?
In terms of tooling, there's two different ways to go about it. One is to just use GitHub and PO edit and or mix that with Jose's DeepL client Python that I referred to in the slides, or you can talk to Jose about, and just use version control and then do that. Or you can use CrowdIn and hook it up to CrowdIn, and if you want the expert, there's Vadim there who's the expert at doing that. And I think that's the best website that I've seen. We tried to use Transifex, but Transifex is like, once you upload the translations, they own the translations. You can't do translations any other way. So we blew them off. But CrowdIn doesn't have the same restriction. You can just do backwards and forwards. So but CrowdIn is not necessarily the only way to do that. But and what we're fundamentally doing, which is a set of PO files in a GitHub hooked up to a translation website, that's pretty standard. And so other than Transifex, who want to own the whole show, I would think most of the translation websites would work. And we don't have a stake in that, whatever works for translating the set of PO files.
Okay, thank you all.
Are we done?
That
Thank
was
you.
all we had time for. for. So.
Thank you very much.